For Catherine, her daughter's wedding was probably the happiest event in her life over the past few years. Looking at the beautiful bride hugging the groom, the woman couldn't hold back her tears. "Be happy, my dear Eve," Catherine whispered, feeling proud of her beautiful daughter. To make sure their children were happy, parents on both sides didn't spare any expense and organized a big celebration for them. Catered food, live music, and countless colorful balloons, as if frozen in the air, delighted all the attendees, filling their hearts with the feelings of love and happiness. The celebration was in full swing when a tall, stately man went on stage and picked up the microphone. The stranger congratulated the newlyweds on their wedding day, and then, with an embarrassed cough, started singing softly and playing the guitar he borrowed from one of the musicians. Hearing the pleasant baritone, Catherine felt a shiver run through her body, and her heart started beating faster. "Is that really him? No, it can't be him," thought the woman, realizing deep down that she couldn't be so wrong. Catherine was sure that she'd recognize his voice, even among hundreds of millions of others. Tears sparkled in her eyes, and her heart was ready to explode in her chest. A storm of emotions and memories swept over the woman, dragging her into a whirlwind of the past, which wasn't always easy or nice. Catherine was born in a provincial town in southern Alabama. Her parents weren't well off. They worked hard at a local factory and raised their daughter in the spirit of tough love. Nevertheless, the girl loved her parents very much, always thinking of them as the best parents in the world. Catherine never had expensive things, such as jewelry, except for a pair of gold earrings she inherited from her grandmother. When Catherine grew up, her parents married her off to Ethan, who was a rather sweet young man. The only issue was that he had an alcohol abuse problem, which is why he kept losing one job after another. Of course, Catherine tried to reason with him at first, but after a series of unsuccessful attempts, she gave up on it. Moreover, by that time, the woman already had her daughter, Eve, and all her attention was devoted to raising the baby. Of course, when Ethan was sober, he did everything he could to ensure his family had everything they needed. But as soon as he had one drink, he'd spend all his hard-earned money on alcohol. Catherine lived in poverty and with her husband's drinking problem for 5 years, and then she realized she couldn't take it anymore. With tears in her eyes, Catherine took a desperate step, and having left her daughter Eve with her parents, she moved to the big city in search of a better life. Of course, Ethan was against it, and then even had a huge fight about Catherine's decision, but she was absolute on changing her life, and there was no stopping her. The determined woman didn't just decide to go to any big city, but to New York of all places, where she hoped to find a good job and rent an apartment. Catherine barely scraped up enough money to buy a train ticket, and having kissed her daughter goodbye, she set off on her journey to a better future. It was the first time the woman left her small provincial hometown, and her inexperience was obvious to most passengers in the train. Eventually, the woman dozed off, lulled by the rhythmic sound of train wheels. Catherine didn't remember how long she slept for, but when she woke up, the New York station was announced over the loudspeaker. The woman looked out the window with joy and realized that she was in the city of her dreams. Remembering that she needed to call her parents and husband, Catherine reached for her purse. However, to the great disappointment of the young traveler, it wasn't there. "Oh God, all my money and my phone were in there," exclaimed the woman, covering her face with her hands. The city, which seemed so fabulous and hospitable, didn't greet Catherine kindly. Tears were streaming down her face as she walked out of the train. The woman didn't know what to do, so she sat down on the nearest bench on the platform and cried softly. She felt deep disappointment over how unfair life was towards her. People walked indifferently, rushing to take care of their own problems. No one seemed to pay any attention to the woman's crying on the platform. Catherine was desperate, sitting on the bench, biting her nails. She had no idea what she was supposed to do next. Suddenly, someone lightly touched the woman by the shoulder and then said, "Hey, why are you crying? What happened? Do you need help?" Catherine looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman about 40 years old in front of her. "I don't even know how to tell you. So many things have piled on, but I don't think you could help me," the woman replied with a sob. But the stranger turned out to be very persistent and didn't drop the subject until Catherine told her everything. "Oh wow, that's not a pretty story you got yourself into. But please don't cry. I have an idea. Why don't you come work for me? I was just looking for a housekeeper, and you're a young and smart woman, and thus you won't need to rent an apartment," suggested the stranger. After the woman's words, Catherine stopped crying and even started smiling. "Thank you. I agree. Trust me, you won't ever regret hiring me," the girl exclaimed excitedly. The woman smiled and told Catherine to follow her as she skillfully maneuvered in the crowd of people at the train station. As it turned out, her mysterious savior was Hannah Edwards. She was the owner of a chain of beauty salons and several perfume stores that brought her a steady income. Her husband, Martin, was also a businessman, so the family could afford to hire help for the house. However, Mrs. Edwards never treated Catherine like help, and therefore their relationship was more like between two friends than between an employer and an employee. The woman told her employer about the city where she grew up, about her family, and about how and why she moved to New York. Mrs. Edwards felt sorry for the housekeeper and always treated her very kindly. Together, they cooked delicious lunches and dinners and always delighted Martin Edwards with their culinary talents. One day, Mrs. Edwards told Catherine that they were expecting relatives to come and visit Mr. Edwards on his 45th birthday. "We have to make sure that everyone is full and happy," Mrs. Edwards said with a smile. Catherine smiled knowingly and started helping Mrs. Edwards. The next day, the Edwards house was full of guests, including the owner's younger brother. His name was Charles, and he was so handsome that Catherine couldn't take her eyes off him. However, the woman kept telling herself, "Stop staring at him. Remember who he is and who you are. You're just a maid here." But as it turned out, Charles also noticed the modest housekeeper and, seizing the moment, invited her for a dance. Catherine agreed, and the beautiful couple whirled in a passionate tango under the envious glances of other guests. Then, when the music stopped playing, Charles took a guitar and sang a song, and his voice seemed magical to Catherine. The guests listened to him sing and were amazed at how talented Mr. Edwards' brother was. That was probably the moment when Catherine realized she'd fallen in love with Charles. It was love at first sight. Of course, the woman realized that she was married and couldn't allow herself to give in to this feeling. But on the other hand, her heart was burning with passion for the sweet and handsome man. Moreover, the woman was sure that the feelings were mutual. Charles stayed at his brother's house for about a month, spending all his free time with Catherine. Mr. Edwards was extremely disapproving of the romantic relationship that developed between the housekeeper and Charles. The businessman was angry, and he couldn't do anything about it. Charles and Catherine fell deeply in love with each other, and so they didn't care what others thought. The young people enjoyed each other's company and dreamed of how they would live together when Catherine divorced her husband and was free. Unfortunately, the fairy tale didn't last long. One day, on their way to a business meeting, Martin and Charles got into a terrible car accident. That day, Catherine felt weary all morning and even got a heartache, and when Mrs. Edwards informed the maid that Charles was dead, Catherine fainted. When the woman regained consciousness, she realized that her life was falling apart right before her eyes. She was hysterical at first. There were tears and screaming. And then, having come to terms with the fact that the man that she loved was dead, Catherine realized that she couldn't stay at the house, where everything reminded her of Charles. The woman honestly told Mrs. Edwards what she felt, and having said goodbye, she returned to her hometown. And there, everything was exactly the same as before. The drunk husband Ethan, and the same life full of hopeless melancholy. Having returned home, Catherine fell into a deep depression, which was very difficult to get out of. Catherine felt as if a piece of her soul had died together with Charles. Ethan didn't know what had caused his wife's depression, but feeling anxious about her condition, he stopped drinking and got his act together. It took a long time, a sea of tears, and incredible effort on Catherine's part, but she did manage to overcome her depression and return to a normal life. Having defeated his addiction, Ethan went into business, trying to make up for the lost years he spent hugging the bottle. Catherine forgave her husband, and having healed her emotional wounds, began to treat him like a near and dear friend. Moreover, she began to help her husband run the business, thereby multiplying the family's income by several times. And then, 7 years after Catherine's memorable trip to New York, Ethan was diagnosed with cancer. Knowing that he was terminally ill, the man continued to run the family business, as if trying to postpone the harsh sentence of fate. But despite getting chemo and other modern treatments, Ethan died a year and a half after being diagnosed. Why is this happening to me? Why can't I just be happy? I'm like the Black Widow, always attracting misfortunes, Catherine said, sighing sadly. Even though the young widow didn't really love Ethan, losing him was still very painful. Several years passed. Catherine was afraid of meeting someone and starting a new relationship, so she continued to live alone, raising her beautiful daughter, Eve. When it was time for the wedding, the loving mother did everything she could to make sure that her daughter had the best of everything and had only the best of memories of that day. And now, when the echoes of the past had finally stopped tormenting Catherine's soul, she looked at the owner of the beautiful voice but didn't recognize him. It was someone else. He looked somewhat like Charles, and the voice was similar, but nothing else. But the stranger thought differently. Approaching Catherine, just like many years ago, he took her by the hand and pulled her into a dance. "Charles, is that you?" asked the bride's mother with tears in her eyes. The man smiled and nodded. It was him, her Charles. As it turned out later, Mr. Edwards wanted to destroy their relationship so badly that he deliberately lied to Catherine, telling her that his brother had died. But the truth was that Charles was badly injured in the accident and had to spend a long time in the hospital, where he underwent a number of plastic surgeries. Then, when the man recovered, he was told that Catherine had returned to her family. Charles had no choice but to accept it, since he understood that his girlfriend had obligations to her family. And only now, having accidentally learned about the wedding of Catherine's daughter, the man decided to pay her a visit. "You won't ever disappear again, will you?" Charles asked, tightly hugging the love of his life. "No, I won't, honey, because there's a whole life ahead of us, and it won't be ruled by conventions," Catherine whispered and proved her words with a passionate kiss.